Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most scandalous career change in ancient history. A woman who literally had to grow a fake beard to keep her day job. Hatshepsut didn't just break the glass ceiling. She shattered it with a golden crook and flail while wearing a ceremonial goatee that would make a hipster weep with envy. We're talking about someone who spent 22 years running the ancient world's most powerful civilization while dressed as a man, which makes every modern discussion about workplace dress codes seem absolutely trivial by comparison. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Whether you're having morning coffee in Tokyo, afternoon tea in London, or midnight snacks in New York, we're all here together to explore one of history's most fascinating stories of power, gender, and the lengths people will go to keep their jobs. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Egypt's first female pharaoh. Most people picture Cleopatra reclining on a golden barge, being fanned by servants while plotting to seduce Julius Caesar. In reality, Hatshepsut was running the ancient world's most successful civilization 1,500 years before Cleopatra was even a twinkle in her Ptolemaic ancestor's eye. Think of it like confusing Oprah with a random Instagram influencer. Sure, they're both successful women, but one built an empire while the other just inherited daddy's money and a really good marketing team. This wasn't some romantic tale of a beautiful queen using her feminine wiles to manipulate men into giving her power. It was the story of a woman who literally had to cosplay as a man for 2 decades just to keep her job. Like if your female CEO had to wear a fake mustache to every board meeting because the investors couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of a woman making more money than their entire extended family combined. The level of daily performance art required to maintain her position would make method actors exhausted just thinking about it. Hatshepsut didn't seduce her way to the throne. She bureaucratically maneuvered her way there with the precision of a modern corporate liar and the patience of someone waiting for their internet to load in 1995. She played the long game so well that she made Game of Thrones look like a children's tea party, while other ancient rulers were busy stabbing their relatives and poisoning their enemies. Hatshepsut was quietly building the most efficient government administration in the ancient world, while simultaneously convincing everyone that her fake beard was completely natural. The misconception extends to how people imagine ancient Egyptian society itself. Popular culture presents Egypt as either a land of mysterious pyramids and mummy curses, or a decadent civilization where beautiful queens lounge around making dramatic speeches about their divine beauty. The reality was far more complex and, frankly, far more interesting. Egypt during Hatshepsut's reign was essentially the ancient world's equivalent of a modern superpower. Imagine the United States, China, and the European Union all rolled into one civilization that controlled the Mediterranean economy and had a monopoly on most of the luxury goods that other kingdoms desperately wanted. The gender dynamics were equally misunderstood. Ancient Egypt actually had relatively progressive attitudes toward women's rights compared to most other ancient civilizations. Egyptian women could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce proceedings, and serve as witnesses in legal cases. But there was still a massive difference between having legal rights and being accepted as the supreme ruler of the entire known world. Hatshepsut wasn't just breaking through a glass ceiling. She was demolishing a cosmic barrier that most people believed kept the universe functioning properly. 1479 BCE was basically the Bronze Age equivalent of Silicon Valley's golden era. Egypt was the world's only superpower, drowning in gold, and their biggest problem was deciding which neighboring kingdom to conquer next for fun. The Nile Valley wasn't some primitive backwater where people lived in mud huts and worshipped cats, though. To be fair, they did worship cats. But they also built pyramids that modern engineers still can't figure out how to replicate without GPS and cranes. The pharaoh controlled everything: the economy, the military, the religion, the weather forecast, and probably what people had for breakfast. If you thought modern CEOs had god complexes, Egyptian pharaohs were literally considered gods. They didn't just have corner offices. They had entire temples dedicated to their divinity, complete with daily offerings and priests whose full-time job was basically being a divine customer service department. The royal succession system was more complicated than a modern tax code written by someone who clearly hated humanity. Typically, the throne passed from father to son, but Egyptian royal families had a delightful habit of marrying their siblings to keep the bloodline pure, which is ancient speak for "we've been inbreeding so long that our family tree looks like a telephone pole." If you thought modern politics were messy, imagine trying to navigate royal succession when your husband is also your half-brother. Your stepson is technically your nephew, and the high priest of Amun has more political influence than a modern Supreme Court justice with a lifetime appointment and a serious grudge against democracy. Enter Hatshepsut, whose name literally means foremost of noble women, basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of being named best female CEO ever, by parents who clearly had high expectations. She was born into the royal family during Egypt's golden age, which was like being born into the Kardashian family if the Kardashians actually contributed something meaningful to society instead of just being famous for being famous. But here's where it gets interesting. Hatshepsut wasn't supposed to be pharaoh. She was married to Thutmose II, who was pharaoh but also happened to be her half-brother because, again, Egyptian royal families made West Virginia look progressive. When Thutmose II died after a relatively short reign, probably from the shock of realizing his wife was smarter than him, he left behind a male heir who was still a child. This heir, Thutmose III, was technically the rightful pharaoh, but he was about as qualified to run a world empire as a modern teenager is to manage a Fortune 500 company. So Hatshepsut did what any reasonable person would do when faced with a child trying to run the ancient world's most powerful nation. She became regent. Think of it like being the world's most overqualified babysitter, except instead of making sure little Timmy doesn't eat glue, you're making sure little Thutmose doesn't accidentally start a war with Nubia because he got bored during a diplomatic meeting. But Hatshepsut wasn't content to just be a placeholder. Within a few years, she had essentially performed the ancient equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover, gradually assuming more and more pharaonic duties until one day she just started wearing the crown, and nobody had the courage to tell her she wasn't supposed to do that. And if you think that's bold, wait until you hear about her solution to the women can't be pharaoh problem. This wasn't just about one woman's ambition to break through ancient Egypt's ultimate glass ceiling. The stability of the entire known world basically depended on Egypt having strong leadership. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader. They were the living embodiment of the god Horus, the high priest of every temple, the commander-in-chief of the military, and the CEO of the world's most successful economy, all rolled into one impressively complicated job description. If Egypt had weak leadership, neighboring kingdoms would start getting ideas about independence. Tribute payments would dry up, trade routes would become unreliable, and the entire Mediterranean economy would collapse faster than a cryptocurrency market during a regulatory crackdown. The pharaoh was basically the ancient world's equivalent of the Federal Reserve Chairman, the Pope, and the President all in one person, except with more gold jewelry and a significantly higher chance of being mummified. But there was one tiny problem. Hatshepsut was a woman, and women weren't supposed to be pharaoh. It wasn't just tradition, it was cosmic law. Met, the concept of divine order and justice, supposedly required that pharaohs be male. Having a female pharaoh was like trying to install Windows on a Mac. Theoretically possible, but everyone involved knew it was going to cause some serious compatibility issues. The priests, nobles, and military commanders who had spent their entire careers serving male pharaohs suddenly had to figure out how to take orders from someone who couldn't even grow a proper pharaonic beard without artificial assistance. It was like the ancient equivalent of having to explain to your grandfather why his new boss at the bank is a woman who's younger than his favorite, the papyrus scroll. But Hatshepsut was just getting started with her reign of fabulously unconventional leadership. The fake beard was only the beginning of her creative solutions to the inconvenient woman problem. She was about to embark on a 20-year experiment in gender-bending governance that would make modern discussions about workplace equality look like a polite disagreement about lunch preferences. What happened next would either prove that women could rule the ancient world just as effectively as men, or it would provide future historians with the most entertaining example of political cross-dressing in human history. Either way, it was going to be absolutely fascinating to watch unfold. If you thought modern workplace dress codes were complicated, try being a woman who had to literally transform herself into a man every single day just to maintain her executive position. Unlike modern gender expression, which is about personal identity and authenticity, Hatshepsut's transformation was pure political theater, like if every female CEO had to wear a fake mustache and speak in a deeper voice during board meetings, because shareholders couldn't handle the concept of a woman making financial decisions. The pharaonic image wasn't just about looking the part. It was about embodying divine masculinity as understood by ancient Egyptian theology. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, and Horus was decidedly male. Hatshepsut couldn't just wear a crown and call it a day. She had to convince an entire civilization that their female ruler was somehow cosmically male enough to maintain the universe's fundamental balance. It was like trying to convince your traditional grandmother that your vegetarian girlfriend is actually a proper meat eater because she occasionally eats fish. This transformation didn't happen overnight. Historical evidence suggests Hatshepsut gradually adopted more masculine royal imagery over several years, like someone slowly adjusting their LinkedIn profile from recent graduate to industry expert until people started believing it. The process required careful political maneuvering, religious justification, and probably the ancient equivalent of a really good PR team. Take the famous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut's architectural masterpiece that was basically her way of saying, I was here, I mattered, and I looked fabulous while doing it. The temple walls are covered with reliefs showing Hatshepsut in full pharaonic regalia, complete with the false beard, royal kilt, and muscular chest that would make a CrossFit instructor weep with envy. But here's the thing. Some of the earlier reliefs show her with a more feminine form, while later ones depict her as increasingly masculine. It's like watching someone's Instagram evolution from college student to influencer, except instead of learning how to use filters, Hatshepsut was learning how to be portrayed as a divinely masculine ruler, while maintaining enough femininity to not completely alienate the people who had known her as a woman for decades. One particularly fascinating relief shows her divine birth myth, where the god Amin supposedly chose her to be pharaoh before she was even born. The story goes that Amun appeared to her mother, Queen Ahmose, in a dream and declared that their child would rule Egypt. This was basically the ancient equivalent of a celebrity endorsement, except the celebrity was the king of the gods, and the endorsement came with cosmic implications. The most telling example might be the red granite obelisks she erected at Karnak Temple. These massive monuments contain inscriptions where Hatshepsut refers to herself using both masculine and feminine pronouns, sometimes within the same sentence. It's like reading a resume where someone can't decide whether to list their name as Jennifer or Jeff, because they're not sure which version will get them the job. The inscriptions essentially say, "I am the daughter of Ra, the son of Amun, the king of Egypt, the woman who rules like a man," which must have given ancient Egyptian grammarians serious headaches. Another relief shows her performing the traditional pharaonic ritual of smiting Egypt's enemies, because nothing says legitimate ruler like being depicted beating your neighbors with a ceremonial mace while wearing a fake beard and a pleased expression. The image is so obviously trying to compensate for something that it makes modern luxury car commercials look subtle. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in ancient Egyptian politics ever was. While Hatshepsut was busy convincing everyone she was masculine enough to be pharaoh, she also had to maintain relationships with the same priests, nobles, and officials who had known her as a traditional royal woman for years. Imagine if your local bank president suddenly started wearing a fake mustache and speaking in a deeper voice. You'd probably still cash your checks there, but you'd definitely have some questions. The religious establishment was particularly tricky to navigate. On one hand, the priests needed to maintain the fiction that Pharaoh was divinely male to preserve Maat and keep the cosmos running smoothly. On the other hand, they had bills to pay and temple maintenance to fund, and Hatshepsut was demonstrably excellent at generating the royal wealth that kept their institutions running. It was like having to choose between theological purity and a really generous donor. Most people are going to find a way to rationalize taking the money. Some inscriptions suggest that certain priests simply refused to acknowledge Hatshepsut's masculine transformation, continuing to use feminine pronouns and titles when referring to her. This created the ancient equivalent of a pronoun controversy, except instead of Twitter arguments, you had religious officials passive-aggressively undermining the pharaoh's gender presentation through bureaucratic paperwork. The military commanders faced a similar dilemma. Egyptian warfare was intensely masculine. Generals were expected to lead charges, engage in personal combat, and generally embody the aggressive, protective masculinity that pharaohs were supposed to represent. But Hatshepsut's approach to foreign policy was more about trade agreements and diplomatic marriages than glorious battlefield victories. She was essentially trying to be a pacifist warrior king, which is about as contradictory as being a vegetarian butcher or a minimalist hoarder. The result was 22 years of the most successful gender performance in political history, but also 2 decades of constant low-level cognitive dissonance for everyone involved. Hatshepsut's reign was prosperous, peaceful, and marked by impressive architectural achievements, but it was also built on the kind of daily, psychological compartmentalization that would give modern therapists job security for centuries. The common people seemed largely unbothered by their cross-dressing pharaoh, probably because their daily lives involved more pressing concerns like, will the Nile flood properly this year? And how do I afford bread? Then is our ruler sufficiently masculine? It's amazing how flexible people's gender expectations become when the economy is doing well and nobody's trying to conscript them for unnecessary wars. However, the noble families who had to interact with Hatshepsut regularly developed increasingly creative ways to navigate the social awkwardness. Court documents show officials using elaborate circumlocutions to avoid having to choose between masculine and feminine titles when addressing the pharaoh. Instead of saying His Majesty or Her Majesty, they'd use phrases like the Divine Presence or the Living Horus. Basically, the ancient equivalent of using someone's full name instead of pronouns when you're not sure about their gender. Identity. The international diplomatic community was apparently baffled by the whole situation. Foreign kings sending letters to Egypt had to figure out how to address a pharaoh, who was obviously female but insisted on masculine titles. Some diplomatic correspondence from the period shows foreign rulers awkwardly attempting to use both masculine and feminine forms, creating sentences that read like they were written by someone having a stroke while trying to be politically correct. Meanwhile, as Hatshepsut was busy revolutionizing ancient Egyptian gender norms through sheer force of will and an impressive collection of fake facial hair, her stepson Thutmose III was growing up in the shadows of her reign. The young man who should have been pharaoh was instead relegated to the role of crown prince and military commander, watching his stepmother run the empire. He was supposed to inherit while he waited for his chance to prove that traditional masculine leadership could be just as effective as whatever Hatshepsut was doing. The relationship between these two would eventually define the second half of Hatshepsut's reign and create the kind of family drama that would make modern reality TV producers weep with envy. If Hatshepsut's gender transformation was a masterclass in political theater, then her relationship with Thutmose III was the ancient world's most awkward family sitcom. Picture this. You're supposed to inherit the family business, but your stepmother decides she's actually better at running it than you would be. So she literally dresses up as a man and takes over while you're stuck in middle management for 22 years. It's like if your stepmother decided she was better suited to be your father and somehow convinced everyone at your family reunion that this was totally normal. This wasn't just about succession politics. It was about two completely different approaches to leadership competing for legitimacy within the same royal household. Hatshepsut represented the let's build cool stuff and make money through trade school of pharaonic governance, while Thutmose III was firmly in the let's conquer our neighbors and take their stuff camp. It was basically the ancient equivalent of having a CEO who wants to focus on sustainable growth working alongside a Q who thinks the company should expand through hostile takeovers and aggressive acquisitions. The situation became even more complicated when you consider that Thutmose III wasn't just sitting around eating grapes and complaining about his stepmother. He was actively serving as a military commander, gaining experience and building relationships with the army officers who would eventually become crucial to his own reign. It was like having the heir apparent working as the company's head of security while watching his stepmother run board meetings in a fake mustache. Consider the delicate dance they performed during state ceremonies. Egyptian royal protocol required both of them to appear together at major religious festivals, but the optics were absolutely bizarre. You had Hatshepsut dressed in full masculine pharaonic regalia, complete with false beard and royal crook, standing next to Thutmose III, who was obviously male, but technically subordinate to his cross-dressing stepmother. It was like watching a corporate hierarchy chart designed by someone who had never seen a functional family dynamic. The most telling example might be their joint appearance at the Opet Festival, one of ancient Egypt's most important religious celebrations. Relief carvings show them both participating in the ceremonies, but Hatshepsut is depicted in the primary pharaonic role, while Thutmose III appears in a supporting capacity. Imagine having to explain to foreign dignitaries why the obvious man is taking orders from someone who is clearly a woman wearing a fake beard, and you'll start to understand why Egyptian diplomatic relations got a bit complicated during this period. Their military relationship was even more fascinating. Thutmose III was genuinely talented at warfare. He would later become one of history's greatest military commanders. But during Hatshepsut's reign, he was essentially the world's most overqualified general serving under a pacifist cross-dressing pharaoh. It was like having Napoleon working as a security guard for someone whose idea of conflict resolution was sending strongly worded letters and gift baskets. One particularly awkward incident involved a minor rebellion in Nubia. Thutmose III wanted to march south with the army and crush the revolt in the traditional pharaonic manner. Lots of violence, some theatrical executions, and maybe a few new tribute payments to demonstrate Egyptian power. Hatshepsut, however, preferred to resolve the situation through diplomatic negotiations and economic incentives. The result was a compromise that satisfied nobody. Thutmose III led a military expedition that was mostly for show, while Hatshepsut's diplomats did the actual work of resolving the conflict. It was like watching a good cop, bad cop routine, where both cops were related and one of them was wearing a disguise. The most revealing insight into their relationship comes from an inscription where Thutmose III refers to Hatshepsut as my father's wife, rather than using any of her royal titles. This was either a subtle act of rebellion or a moment of genuine confusion about how to address someone who was simultaneously his stepmother, his pharaoh, and his boss. The ancient equivalent of having to figure out whether to call your stepmother Mom, Mrs. Johnson, or Your Majesty, depending on whether you're at the dinner table or in a board meeting. This wasn't an isolated case of succession weirdness. Egyptian royal families had a long history of creative solutions to inheritance problems. The Ptolemies later turned sibling marriage into an art form, and Cleopatra famously had to share power with her younger brother, whom she eventually had killed to simplify the management structure. But Hatshepsut's situation was unique because it involved gender transformation rather than just murder or marriage. The pattern that emerges is one of pragmatic, power-sharing arrangements that prioritize stability over traditional protocol. Egyptian civilization was incredibly conservative in most respects, but when it came to maintain political continuity and economic prosperity, they were surprisingly flexible about bending the rules. It was like having a country run by accountants who cared more about keeping the books balanced than following the employee handbook. Other examples of creative succession solutions include pharaohs who appointed their daughters as gods' wives to give them political authority, and rulers who essentially created co-pharaoh arrangements to ensure smooth transitions. The common thread was that Egyptian royal families were willing to get creative with gender roles and family structures, if it meant avoiding civil wars and maintaining the economic engine that kept their civilization running. The social and political factors that enabled these arrangements were largely economic. Egypt's wealth came from the Nile's annual floods, which required consistent agricultural management, and from trade relationships that depended on political stability. A succession crisis could disrupt both, potentially leading to famine, economic collapse, and foreign invasion. It was easier to accept a cross-dressing stepmother as pharaoh than to risk the kind of dynastic warfare that could destroy the entire system. The effects of the Hatshepsut Thutmose III arrangement were profound, but also contradictory. On one hand, Egypt experienced unprecedented prosperity and stability during Hatshepsut's reign. Her focus on trade, construction projects, and diplomatic relations created a golden age of cultural achievement and economic growth. The country was so wealthy and stable that neighboring kingdoms stopped trying to invade and started sending tribute instead. On the other hand, the arrangement created a generation of Egyptian leaders who had very strange ideas about gender roles and political authority. Young nobles grew up thinking it was normal for women to rule while wearing fake beards, and military commanders had to learn how to take orders from someone who resolved conflicts through gift-giving rather than warfare. It was like raising a generation of executives who thought business meetings should include costume changes and that hostile takeovers should be replaced with friendly negotiations over tea. The unintended consequences were significant. Thutmose III's eventual ascension to sole power was marked by an almost manic desire to prove his masculine military credentials, leading to 17 military campaigns that expanded Egypt's empire to its greatest extent. It was like watching someone who had been forced to be polite at family dinners for 20 years, suddenly getting permission to express their true feelings about their relatives. The benefits were more obvious. Egypt avoided the succession wars that plagued other ancient kingdoms, maintained economic prosperity during a period of international instability, and demonstrated that effective leadership didn't necessarily require traditional gender presentations. Hatshepsut's reign proved that women could rule just as effectively as men, though it took her wearing a fake beard for 22 years to make the point. The long-term effects shaped Egyptian politics for centuries. Future female rulers like Nefertiti and Cleopatra had precedents to point to when asserting their authority, even if none of them took the cross-dressing approach quite as far as Hatshepsut did. The precedent of flexible succession arrangements also influenced later dynasties, who were more willing to experiment with co-rulers and power-sharing agreements. Yet even as Hatshepsut and Thutmose III were working out their complicated family dynamics, the real drama was happening behind the scenes among the priests, nobles, and officials who had to navigate this unprecedented situation on a daily basis. The court politics of maintaining a functioning government while everyone pretended their cross-dressing pharaoh was completely normal created the kind of bureaucratic dysfunction that would make modern government officials feel right at home. The next chapter of this story involves the elaborate social choreography required to keep Egyptian civilization running smoothly while everyone involved was essentially participating in a decades-long improvisational theater performance about gender, power, and divine authority. By the 15th year of Hatshepsut's reign, the delicate balance of pretending everything was normal while the pharaoh cross-dressed her way through state ceremonies had reached a breaking point. The immediate crisis wasn't about gender politics or succession disputes. It was about obelisks, which sounds ridiculous until you realize that in ancient Egypt, obelisk placement was basically the equivalent of nuclear diplomacy. These weren't just decorative lawn ornaments. They were massive granite monuments that proclaimed divine authority, territorial claims, and political legitimacy to anyone within a 50-mile radius. The tension had been building for years between Hatshepsut's building projects and the traditional expectations of pharaonic monumentality. While previous pharaohs had built temples and monuments to celebrate military victories and divine favor, Hatshepsut's architectural program was more like a massive public works project designed to demonstrate that prosperity and trade were just as impressive as conquest and warfare. It was the ancient equivalent of a CEO who builds beautiful corporate headquarters instead of acquiring competitors. The key players involved in this crisis were Hatshepsut herself, obviously still committed to her masculine pharaonic persona. Thutmose III, now an experienced military commander watching his stepmother spend the empire's resources on what he probably considered oversized lawn decorations. Senenmut, Hatshepsut's chief architect and possibly romantic partner, and Hatshepsut, the high priest of Amun, who had to navigate the theological implications of a cross-dressing pharaoh's building program while maintaining his own political position. The stakes couldn't have been higher. How Egypt's rulers chose to demonstrate their legitimacy would influence the kingdom's international reputation, domestic stability, and religious continuity for generations to come. The crisis came to a head when Hatshepsut announced her intention to erect two massive red granite obelisks at Karnak Temple, directly in front of the existing structures built by her deceased husband and his predecessors. This wasn't just about adding some decorative elements to the temple complex. It was about making a statement so large and permanent that it would be visible from space if satellites had existed in 1460 BCE. The planning phase alone was a masterpiece of bureaucratic dysfunction. Senenmut, her chief architect, had designed the obelisks to be the tallest ever erected in Egypt, standing nearly 100 feet high and weighing about 320 tons each. The inscriptions were to proclaim Hatshepsut's divine authority and eternal legacy, written in both masculine and feminine pronouns, because apparently even monument inscriptions couldn't escape the royal identity crisis. But here's where it gets interesting. The proposed location for these obelisks would require partially dismantling existing structures built by previous pharaohs, including her own husband. It was like announcing that you're going to tear down your predecessor's office building to construct a larger monument to yourself. Except the predecessor was your dead husband, and the office building was a sacred temple complex. The high priest, Hatshepsut, found himself in the impossible position of having to approve a construction project that was architecturally impressive, theologically questionable, and politically inflammatory, all at the same time. The priest's meetings about this project must have been legendary. Imagine trying to explain to a religious council why your cross-dressing pharaoh wants to build the world's largest granite monuments to herself while simultaneously honoring the gods and respecting previous rulers. Thutmose III's reaction was predictably military. He suggested that if they were going to quarry and transport massive granite monuments, they should at least make them commemorate actual military victories, rather than trade agreements and building projects. The heated discussions between stepmother and stepson about appropriate royal monument themes probably sounded like a really dysfunctional family argument about home renovation projects, except with cosmic implications. The actual construction process became a drama in itself. The obelisks had to be quarried in Aswan, transported 200 miles down the Nile during flood season, and then erected using techniques that modern engineers still don't fully understand. The logistical challenges involved thousands of workers, custom-built ships, and engineering solutions that wouldn't be matched until the construction of medieval cathedrals. During the transportation phase, one of the massive granite monuments nearly sank its specially constructed barge, leading to a rescue operation that involved half the Egyptian Navy and probably gave everyone involved serious anxiety about their job security. The incident became legendary among Egyptian workers, who apparently developed a drinking song about the time Pharaoh's giant stone nearly drowned the entire royal construction crew. The climax came during the actual erection ceremony. Hatshepsut, dressed in full masculine pharaonic regalia and probably sweating profusely under her ceremonial beard, had to perform the traditional rituals while standing next to monuments that were literally the largest objects human beings had ever successfully moved and erected. The ceremony required her to invoke the gods' blessings, declare her eternal divine authority, and somehow maintain her masculine persona, while obviously being incredibly proud of what was essentially the ancient world's most expensive vanity project. The response was as divided as you'd expect when someone spends the equivalent of a modern military budget on personal monuments while wearing a costume. The common people were apparently impressed by the sheer audacity and engineering achievement. It's hard not to be awed by 100-foot granite obelisks, regardless of your feelings about the pharaoh's gender presentation. The workers who had actually moved and erected these impossibly massive monuments developed a kind of professional pride that transcended politics. The priesthood was split between theological concerns and practical admiration. On one hand, the obelisks were undeniably impressive and brought prestige to the temple complex. On the other hand, they were inscribed with text that called their female pharaoh both daughter of Ra and son of Amun in the same sentence, which must have given the temple scribes serious headaches when they tried to explain Egyptian religion to foreign visitors. The international diplomatic community was baffled but impressed. Foreign ambassadors visiting Egypt now had to contend with monuments that were literally the largest human-made objects they had ever seen, erected by a cross-dressing pharaoh who seemed to have unlimited resources and questionable priorities. The psychological impact on Egypt's neighbors was probably significant. It's hard to plan invasions against a kingdom whose ruler casually moves 320-ton granite blocks as a hobby. Thutmose III's reaction was more complex. While he may have disagreed with the project's priorities, he couldn't argue with its success. The obelisks demonstrated Egyptian engineering capabilities, artistic achievement, and economic prosperity in ways that military campaigns couldn't match. It was like watching your stepmother spend your inheritance on something you thought was ridiculous, only to discover that it actually increased the family's social status and property values. The immediate political fallout was minimal because the project's success made criticism seem petty. How do you argue against monuments that represent the pinnacle of human engineering achievement just because you don't like the pharaoh's personal style choices? The obelisk stood as permanent proof that Hatshepsut's reign was successful, regardless of anyone's feelings about traditional gender roles. This obelisk incident wasn't just about monument construction. It was about how power justifies itself and creates lasting legacies. Hatshepsut understood that while military victories could be forgotten and trade agreements could be renegotiated, massive granite monuments inscribed with your achievements were going to be around for literally thousands of years. The deeper meaning was that Hatshepsut was playing a longer game than her critics realized. While they were focused on immediate concerns about gender roles and succession politics, she was building a legacy that would outlast everyone involved in the controversy. Those obelisks are still standing today, nearly 3,500 years later, which means her strategy worked better than most modern marketing campaigns. What the incident revealed about Egyptian society was that their commitment to engineering excellence and architectural achievement transcended their concerns about social conventions. When faced with the choice between maintaining traditional gender expectations and supporting the pharaoh, who could organize the construction of impossible monuments, they chose the monuments. The long-term effects influenced how future pharaohs approached legacy building. Later rulers understood that impressive construction projects could establish legitimacy and ensure historical remembrance in ways that military campaigns or diplomatic achievements couldn't match. The lesson was that if you're going to be controversial, at least be controversially successful on a scale that's literally unmistakable. Why historians still debate this incident is that it represents a perfect example of how individual ambition, social constraints, and technological capabilities intersect to create historical change. Hatshepsut's obelisks were simultaneously personal vanity projects, religious monuments, engineering marvels, and political statements. They succeeded on all levels, which is probably why they're still standing, while most of her critics have been forgotten for millennia. Around Hatshepsut's gender-bending reign and Thutmose III's patient waiting game, a colorful cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in keeping ancient Egypt's most unconventional government functioning. These weren't just background figures. They were the people who had to figure out how to run a civilization, while their boss wore a fake beard and their future boss waited in the wings with barely concealed military ambitions. The daily reality of working in Hatshepsut's administration must have felt like participating in the world's longest-running improvisational theater performance, where everyone had to stay in character for decades, while pretending that nothing unusual was happening. First up was Senenmut, Hatshepsut's chief architect, and the man responsible for designing some of the most beautiful buildings in ancient Egypt. Senenmut was basically the ancient equivalent of a celebrity architect, except instead of designing museums and concert halls for wealthy clients, he was creating eternal monuments for a cross-dressing pharaoh who may or may not have been his romantic partner. The guy went from humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt, which was like going from intern to CEO, except your boss might be sleeping with you and definitely required you to pretend she was a man in public. Senenmut's tomb contains some of the most revealing artwork from Hatshepsut's reign, including scenes that show him in intimate proximity to the royal family and inscriptions that suggest he had unprecedented access to royal privileges. Either he was the most trusted government official in Egyptian history, or he was having an affair with the pharaoh while simultaneously designing her monuments, which would make him the ancient world's most successful multitasker. His architectural innovations included the first use of extensive gardens in royal complexes and a development of construction techniques that allowed for the creation of monuments on an unprecedented scale. The relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut reveals the complex personal dynamics that existed within the elaborate political theater of her reign. If they were romantically involved, it adds another layer of complexity to the gender performance she maintained. Imagine trying to conduct a secret relationship while publicly presenting as a different gender, all while running one of history's most powerful civilizations. The emotional and psychological demands would have been staggering for both parties involved. Then there was Hatshepsut, the high priest of Amun, who had the unenviable job of maintaining religious orthodoxy while serving a pharaoh who challenged every traditional assumption about divine kingship. Hatshepsut represented the ultimate religious politician. He needed to keep the gods happy, the priests employed, and the donations flowing, all while somehow explaining why they're female pharaohs. Fake beard was cosmically appropriate. His career was basically a 20-year theology exam with no correct answers and eternal consequences for failure. Hatshepsut's political survival required extraordinary flexibility and creativity in religious interpretation. He had to develop theological justifications for female pharaonic authority that satisfied conservative priests while supporting innovations that kept Egypt prosperous and stable. This involved reinterpreting ancient texts, creating new ritual procedures, and managing internal temple politics that could make modern corporate governance look simple by comparison. The most underappreciated figure was probably Nehesi, Hatshepsut's chancellor, who managed the day-to-day operations of running the ancient world's most successful economy, while everyone else was focused on gender politics and monument construction. Nehesi was the guy who made sure taxes got collected, trade agreements got negotiated, and government workers got paid, regardless of whatever identity crisis the royal family was having this week. He was like a competent CFO working for a company whose CEO insisted on conducting board meetings in drag, while the heir apparent practiced military maneuvers in the parking lot. Nehesi's administrative records reveal the remarkable efficiency of Hatshepsut's government. Under his management, Egypt's bureaucracy functioned with a level of organization and effectiveness that wouldn't be matched by most governments until the modern era. He developed new systems for record keeping, created standardized procedures for trade negotiations, and managed economic policies that generated unprecedented prosperity while funding massive construction projects and maintaining military readiness. Another crucial figure was Uzurman, who served as vizier during part of Hatshepsut's reign and had to coordinate between the various power centers that kept Egyptian government functioning. Uzurman's job was essentially to serve as chief operating officer for a government, where the CEO was performing elaborate gender theater, the heir apparent was building his own power base, and various department heads had competing agendas and conflicting loyalties. His success in maintaining administrative continuity during this period demonstrates the institutional strength that Hatshepsut's government had developed. These weren't isolated incidents of individual excellence. They were part of an intricate web of relationships that kept Egyptian government functioning despite its fundamental weirdness. Senenmut and Hatshepsut, for example, had to coordinate on temple construction projects that satisfied both architectural ambitions and religious requirements while somehow accommodating a pharaoh who couldn't decide which pronouns to use in official Inscriptions. Their collaboration produced some of the most beautiful and innovative religious architecture in ancient history, demonstrating that creative partnerships could flourish even within the constraints of complex political theater. The political networks were fascinating because they had to function on multiple levels simultaneously. In public, everyone had to maintain the fiction that Hatshepsut was legitimately masculine and divinely ordained. In private, they had to work with the reality that she was a woman making decisions about traditionally male spheres, like military policy and religious ceremony. It was like running a government where everyone had to maintain different personas depending on whether they were in official meetings or informal conversations, creating a level of social complexity that would exhaust modern politicians who only have to worry about managing their public image rather than maintaining an entirely fictional gender identity. One revealing example involves the coordination between Nehesi's economic policies and Senenmut's building projects. The massive construction programs that defined Hatshepsut's reign required unprecedented logistical coordination between treasury officials, labor managers, and religious authorities. These weren't just construction projects. They were economic stimulus programs that employed thousands of workers while creating lasting monuments to royal authority. The success of these projects required careful coordination between officials, who might have different opinions about their pharaoh's gender presentation, but could agree on the importance of maintaining Egypt's prosperity and international prestige. The relationships became even more complex when you consider how they intersected with Thutmose III's military career. While Hatshepsut's civilian officials were managing domestic prosperity, Thutmose III was building relationships with army commanders who would eventually become crucial to his own reign. The result was a parallel power structure where civilian bureaucrats loyal to Hatshepsut worked alongside military officers who were personally devoted to Thutmose III, creating a government where different departments had different ultimate loyalties while somehow maintaining overall policy coherence. One particularly interesting case involves a trade expedition to Punt, modern-day Somalia, Ethiopia, that required coordination between Hatshepsut's diplomatic initiatives, Nehesi's economic planning, and Thutmose III's military escort services. The expedition was remarkably successful, bringing back exotic goods including live trees, animals, and trade goods that had never been seen in Egypt before. But it also demonstrated how the three power centers of Hatshepsut's government, royal authority, civilian administration, and military command, could work together despite their fundamental tensions when the stakes were high enough and the potential benefits were clear enough to motivate cooperation. The expedition to Punt also reveals how Hatshepsut's government balanced innovation with tradition. While the trip itself was unprecedented in its scale and ambition, it was justified using traditional rhetoric about pharaonic duty to bring exotic goods to the gods and demonstrate Egypt's power to foreign peoples. This pattern of using traditional language to justify innovative policies appeared throughout Hatshepsut's reign, allowing her government to pursue new approaches while maintaining the appearance of continuity with established customs. To understand how these relationships functioned, you have to understand daily life in ancient Egypt during what historians call the height of the New Kingdom period. This wasn't a primitive society struggling with basic survival. It was a sophisticated civilization with complex social hierarchies, established bureaucratic procedures, and cultural expectations that have been developing for over 1,000 years. The level of literacy among government officials was remarkably high. Administrative records were maintained with extraordinary precision, and the legal system provided predictable procedures for resolving disputes and managing conflicts. The average Egyptian's daily routine involved agricultural work timed to the Nile's annual flood cycle, participation in religious festivals that reinforced social bonds, and interaction with government officials who collected taxes and organized Labor projects. Most people's contact with royal authority came through local administrators rather than direct interaction with the pharaoh, which meant that Hatshepsut's gender presentation was less immediately relevant to their lives than her government's. Effectiveness in maintaining the conditions that allowed ordinary people to prosper. Egyptian society was intensely hierarchical, but also surprisingly meritocratic for ancient standards. People like Senenmut could rise from humble origins to positions of enormous influence based on talent and royal favor. But they also had to navigate complex social expectations about appropriate behavior for their new status. It was like a society where social mobility was possible, but required mastering increasingly complicated etiquette rules as you moved up the ladder, including the ability to participate in whatever collective fictions were necessary to maintain political stability. The religious context was equally important for understanding how these relationships functioned. Egyptians believed that Pharaoh's divine authority maintained the cosmic balance that kept the universe functioning properly. This meant that any threat to royal legitimacy could theoretically cause the Nile to stop flooding, the sun to stop rising, or the afterlife to stop accepting properly mummified souls. The stakes of getting royal protocol wrong weren't just political. They were existential, which created enormous pressure on everyone involved to find ways to accommodate Hatshepsut's unconventional leadership while maintaining the religious traditions that kept the cosmos functioning. Social structures during this period were also influenced by Egypt's international dominance. As the ancient world's dominant superpower, Egypt attracted immigrants, traders, and diplomats from across the Mediterranean and Africa. This created a cosmopolitan atmosphere where cultural mixing was common, but it also meant that Egyptian royal behavior was scrutinized by foreign observers who might not understand the local context of Hatshepsut's unconventional leadership style. The international dimension added another layer of complexity to the social performance required from everyone in Hatshepsut's government. Perhaps most fascinating was the daily cognitive dissonance that everyone involved had to manage without showing signs of the psychological strain involved. Take Senenmut's situation. He was designing some of the most beautiful and permanent monuments in human history for a pharaoh who was essentially performing an elaborate drag act that required constant maintenance and social cooperation. His architectural legacy would outlast Egyptian civilization itself, but it was created in service of a gender performance that everyone knew was artificial, but nobody could acknowledge as such without potentially destabilizing the entire government. The broader irony was that Hatshepsut's reign was incredibly successful by every objective measure: economic prosperity, architectural achievement, international prestige, domestic stability. But it was built on a foundation of collective pretense. That must have been emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. It was like working for the most successful company in history, while having to pretend that the CEO's obvious toupee was actually natural hair. Except the consequences of breaking character could include civil war and economic collapse rather than just awkward conversations in the break room. That another contradiction involved the military establishment's relationship with peaceful prosperity. Thutmose III's officers were training for wars that Hatshepsut's diplomacy was preventing, creating a professional military that was superbly prepared for conflicts that kept not happening. It was like maintaining a fire department in a town where the fire chief's main strategy was fireproofing everything so effectively that there were never any fires to fight, leaving highly trained professionals with nothing to do except practice and wait for opportunities that might never come. The religious contradictions were even more complex and theologically challenging. Egyptian theology required Pharaoh to be masculine, but Egyptian prosperity clearly demonstrated divine favor. For Hatshepsut's reign, the priests had to somehow reconcile theological orthodoxy with obvious divine approval. leading to increasingly creative interpretations of religious doctrine that would make modern religious scholars dizzy trying to follow the logical connections. Modern parallels to these contradictions might include contemporary discussions about leadership styles, gender roles in professional settings, and the tension between traditional expectations and effective performance. Hatshepsut's reign essentially asked whether results mattered more than conformity to social norms, a question that remains relevant in modern corporate and political contexts where unconventional leaders often achieve impressive results while challenging traditional expectations about authority and presentation. Everything changed when Hatshepsut reached her 20th year as pharaoh, and the uncomfortable reality finally hit everyone involved. She wasn't going to live forever, and somebody was going to have to figure out how to transition from the ancient, world's most successful cross-dressing ruler to whatever came next. The succession question had been the elephant in the room for 2 decades, except the elephant was wearing a fake beard, and everyone had agreed to pretend it was a regular male elephant for the sake of political stability. The cognitive dissonance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as Hatshepsut aged and Thutmose III grew more experienced and confident in his abilities. The immediate catalyst for this shift wasn't a dramatic crisis or external threat. It was the much more mundane realization that Hatshepsut was approaching her 50s, which in ancient Egypt meant she was entering the seriously elderly category. Egyptian life expectancy meant that most pharaohs didn't rule for more than 20 years, and Hatshepsut had already exceeded that benchmark while maintaining a demanding schedule of monument construction, diplomatic negotiations, and daily gender performance that would exhaust someone half her age. The physical demands of constantly maintaining royal authority, while wearing ceremonial regalia and performing masculine royal duties, were taking their toll. The psychological pressures were equally significant. 20 years of maintaining an elaborate gender performance while running one of history's most complex governments had created stress levels that would challenge modern executives who only have to worry about quarterly earnings reports rather than cosmic balance and divine legitimacy. Hatshepsut was showing signs of fatigue that went beyond normal aging. She was experiencing the exhaustion that comes from decades of never being able to fully relax or drop the performance that enabled her authority. The key factors that led to this transformation were both biological and political. Physically, Hatshepsut was showing signs of the health problems that would eventually lead to her death, though she was still capable of performing royal duties with the competence that had characterized her entire reign. Politically, Thutmose III had grown from a frustrated teenager into an experienced military commander with his own power base and an increasingly obvious desire to actually rule the empire he was supposed to inherit. The dynamic between them had shifted from guardian and ward to 2 competent adults with different approaches to leadership who needed to find a way to coexist without destroying the kingdom they both cared about. But perhaps most importantly, the generation of officials who had originally supported Hatshepsut's unconventional ascension was aging out of government service. The people who had been willing to participate in the initial gender-bending political experiment were being replaced by younger officials who hadn't been part of the original compromise and were less invested in maintaining the elaborate social fiction that had enabled Hatshepsut's reign. These new officials had grown up during her rule and accepted her authority as normal, but they also had different ideas about how government should function and were more open to alternative approaches to royal leadership. The international situation was also changing in ways that favored a transition to more traditional leadership styles. Several tributary states had been testing Egyptian resolve during the later years of Hatshepsut's reign, apparently calculating that her peaceful approach meant Egypt was less willing to use military force to maintain its dominance. These challenges weren't serious enough to threaten Egyptian security, But they suggested that Hatshepsut's diplomatic success had created a perception of weakness that could become problematic if not addressed through more aggressive policies. The transition didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over several years in a series of subtle shifts that demonstrated just how carefully choreographed royal succession had to be in ancient Egypt. The first signs appeared in official inscriptions, where Thutmose III's name began appearing more frequently alongside Hatshepsut's in royal decrees and ceremonial texts. It was like watching a corporate succession plan unfold in slow motion, with the heir apparent gradually taking on more responsibilities while the current CEO remained nominally in charge, but with steadily diminishing actual authority. The process required extraordinary diplomatic skill from both Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, who had to navigate the transition without creating the impression that either was being forced out or taking power illegitimately. They needed to maintain the fiction that the change was natural and divinely approved while accommodating the reality that they had different approaches to leadership and different priorities for Egypt's future. The challenge was complicated by the fact that their relationship was both personal and political. They were stepmother and stepson, as well as current ruler and heir apparent. Resistance to change came from predictable sources, but also from some unexpected directions. Senenmut and other officials whose careers were closely tied to Hatshepsut's success had obvious reasons to prefer the status quo. They had spent decades building a government system that worked effectively under female leadership, and they weren't eager to see it dismantled by someone whose idea of problem-solving involved military campaigns rather than architectural projects. These officials had developed expertise in managing the unique challenges of Hatshepsut's reign, and they worried that their skills might become less valuable under a more traditional pharaoh. The priesthood was similarly divided along lines that didn't necessarily follow obvious patterns. Some religious authorities had grown comfortable with the theological flexibility required to accommodate a cross-dressing pharaoh, while others were eager to return to more orthodox arrangements. The high priest of Amun found himself mediating between factions that wanted completely different approaches to royal legitimacy and divine authority, trying to maintain temple unity while accommodating political changes that could affect religious institutions for generations. More surprisingly, resistance also came from some quarters of Egyptian society that had benefited from Hatshepsut's peaceful policies. Merchants and traders who had prospered during her reign were concerned that a more militaristic pharaoh might prioritize conquest over commerce, potentially disrupting the trade relationships that had made Egypt so wealthy. Workers employed on her massive construction projects worried that new leadership might have different priorities and less interest in funding the architectural programs that provided their livelihoods. Thutmose III, meanwhile, was playing a careful game of demonstrating his readiness for sole rule without appearing to challenge Hatshepsut's current authority. He increased his visibility at state ceremonies, took on more significant military responsibilities, and began building relationships with officials who would become important during his eventual reign. It was like watching someone position themselves for a promotion while being careful not to undermine their current boss. Except the promotion involved inheriting control of the ancient world's most powerful civilization. The champions of change included military commanders who were eager for a more aggressive foreign policy, younger officials who were less invested in maintaining Hatshepsut's gender performance, and probably Thutmose III himself, though he was diplomatic enough not to openly advocate for his stepmother's retirement. These supporters had to be careful about how they expressed their preferences, since openly criticizing Hatshepsut's approach could be interpreted as disloyalty or treason. Specific steps in the transition process included joint appearances at major festivals where both rulers performed pharaonic roles, military campaigns where Thutmose III commanded troops while Hatshepsut remained in the capital, and construction projects that honored both rulers' achievements. The goal was to create a seamless transition that preserved political stability, while gradually shifting real authority from the cross-dressing pharaoh to her, traditionally masculine successor. The major breakthrough moment came when Hatshepsut began allowing Thutmose III to perform certain religious ceremonies that had previously been her exclusive responsibility. This was symbolically huge. It meant she was sharing the divine authority that justified her entire reign with someone who represented a completely different approach to royal leadership. The religious ceremonies were the most sacred and politically significant aspects of pharaonic authority, so transferring them to Thutmose III was essentially acknowledging that the transition had moved beyond administrative convenience to fundamental changes in royal power. The new arrangement that emerged was essentially a carefully managed dual monarchy where Hatshepsut retained ceremonial authority, while Thutmose III assumed increasing responsibility for day-to-day governance, especially military and foreign policy matters. It was like having a chairman of the board who still showed up to important meetings while the CEO handled actual business operations. Except the board meetings involved religious ceremonies that determined cosmic balance and the business operations. Included managing an empire that controlled most of the known world. This system was different from Hatshepsut's earlier reign in several crucial ways. First, the elaborate gender performance that had characterized her rule became less central to royal presentation. While she continued to appear in masculine pharaonic regalia and major ceremonies, the daily business of government involved less theatrical gender transformation and more practical power sharing between two competent administrators with different strengths and priorities. Second, the government's priorities shifted noticeably toward military preparedness and foreign policy activism. Hatshepsut's focus on trade, construction, and diplomacy remained important, but Thutmose III's influence brought renewed attention to border security and imperial expansion. It was like watching a company's strategic focus shift from sustainable growth to aggressive market expansion as new leadership gained influence. Except the market was the entire Mediterranean world, and expansion involved conquering neighboring kingdoms rather than acquiring competitors. The rules and norms of royal behavior also evolved during this period. Courtiers who had spent decades learning to navigate the complex etiquette of addressing a cross-dressing pharaoh suddenly had to adjust to a more traditional masculine authority structure. Official correspondence began using more conventional royal titles and pronouns, and ceremonial protocols became less dependent on elaborate gender performance. It was like working for a company that suddenly changed its dress code from business formal with elaborate costumes to traditional business attire, except the costumes had included fake beards and the stakes involved cosmic balance rather than just looking professional. What stayed the same was Egypt's fundamental prosperity and stability. The transition was managed so skillfully that it didn't disrupt the economic and diplomatic relationships that had made Hatshepsut's reign successful. Trade continued flowing. Through Egyptian ports, construction projects proceeded on schedule, and international partners didn't seem particularly concerned about changes in Egyptian leadership style. The bureaucratic systems that Hatshepsut had developed continued to function effectively under the new arrangement, demonstrating the institutional strength that her government had built over 2 decades. What changed dramatically was the kingdom's military posture and international relationships. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt had been a prosperous, peaceful superpower that preferred diplomacy to warfare and resolved conflicts through negotiation rather than conquest. Under the emerging Thutmose III influence, Egypt began preparing for the kind of aggressive imperial expansion that would characterize his later sole reign. Military training intensified, diplomatic communications became more demanding, and tributary states began receiving less gentle reminders about their obligations to Egypt. The psychological atmosphere of government also shifted significantly. During Hatshepsut's reign, the court had operated under constant low-level tension, created by the need to maintain collective fiction about royal gender identity. Under the dual monarchy arrangement, this tension was replaced by different kinds of stress related to managing competing power centers and balancing different approaches to royal authority. Officials had to learn to work with two pharaohs who had different priorities and communication styles while maintaining the appearance of unified government. Assessing whether this change was positive or negative depends entirely on your perspective and priorities, much like evaluating any major organizational transition in modern corporations or governments. From the standpoint of gender equality and political innovation, Hatshepsut's gradual transition away from active leadership represented the end of ancient history's most successful experiment in female rule. She had proven that women could govern effectively at the highest levels, but her eventual stepping back suggested that such achievements were temporary aberrations, rather than permanent changes to political possibilities. From a practical governance perspective, the transition was remarkably successful by almost any measure. Egypt maintained its prosperity and stability while smoothly shifting from one leadership style to another without civil war, economic disruption, or international crisis. It was like watching a company successfully navigate a major leadership transition without losing market share or employee confidence. Except the company was an entire civilization, and the market included most of the known world. Different perspectives on the change reflected different priorities and different assessments of what constituted successful leadership. Military officials and younger courtiers generally welcomed the shift toward more traditional masculine leadership and aggressive foreign policy, seeing it as a return to proper pharaonic behavior after 2 decades of unusual arrangements. Older officials and those whose careers had been built around Hatshepsut's unconventional approach were more ambivalent about the changes, recognizing their necessity while regretting the end of an era that had brought unprecedented prosperity and stability. The short-term effects were largely positive by most measures. Egypt's government continued to function effectively. The succession question that had loomed over the kingdom for years was finally being resolved in an orderly manner, and the dual monarchy arrangement provided stability while preparing for an eventual transition to sole rule under Thutmose III. International relations remained stable. Domestic prosperity continued, and the elaborate construction projects that had defined Hatshepsut's reign proceeded toward completion without disruption. Long-term effects were more complex and harder to evaluate. The end of Hatshepsut's active reign marked the conclusion of ancient Egypt's most significant experiment with female leadership. While later queens like Nefertiti and Cleopatra would wield significant power, none would rule as independently or for as long as Hatshepsut had. The precedent she had established proved that women could rule effectively, but it also demonstrated the extraordinary costs and compromises required to make such rule acceptable to ancient societies. Modern judgment tends to view the transition as both inevitable and unfortunate. Inevitable because ancient Egyptian society wasn't fundamentally prepared to permanently accept female leadership, but unfortunate because Hatshepsut's reign had demonstrated the potential benefits of such acceptance. Contemporary discussions about gender equality in leadership positions often reference Hatshepsut's experience as evidence that artificial barriers to female authority harm societies by preventing talented individuals from contributing their full potential. Contemporary views were probably more pragmatic and less ideologically driven than modern assessments. Most Egyptians likely cared more about continued prosperity and stability than about the gender politics of their rulers. As long as the Nile flooded properly, taxes remained reasonable and foreign enemies stayed conquered. The specific details of royal succession were less important than the results. The average Egyptian farmer or craftsman probably evaluated the transition based on whether it affected their daily lives rather than whether it represented progress or regression in terms of gender equality. The transition also revealed the strength of the institutional systems that Hatshepsut had built during her reign. The fact that Egypt could smoothly shift from her unconventional leadership style to Thutmose III's more traditional approach without major disruption demonstrated that her government had created bureaucratic and administrative structures that could function effectively regardless of the personal characteristics of individual rulers. This institutional strength would prove crucial during the later imperial expansion that characterized Thutmose III's sole reign. In the years immediately following the transition to shared power, Egypt experienced what historians now recognize as one of the most dramatic personality transformations in ancient political history. It was as if the kingdom had been run by a diplomatic architect for 22 years and then suddenly found itself governed by someone whose idea of foreign policy was conquer everything within marching distance and ask questions later. The speed and completeness of this transformation would have given modern political scientists whiplash trying to analyze the institutional and psychological factors involved. Thutmose III's emergence as the dominant ruler revealed just how much military energy had been pent up during Hatshepsut's peaceful reign. The army that had spent 2 decades maintaining readiness while their cross-dressing Pharaoh resolved conflicts through gift baskets and trade agreements was like a formula. One race car that had been stuck in city traffic for years. When Thutmose III finally got the keys to the empire, the results were spectacular and slightly terrifying for everyone involved, including Egypt's neighbors who had grown comfortable with the kingdom's peaceful approach to international relations. The psychological dynamics of this transition were fascinating and complex. Thutmose III had spent his entire adult life watching his stepmother run the empire he was supposed to inherit, learning statecraft while being relegated to secondary roles, and observing the success of approaches to leadership that were completely different from traditional pharaonic models. The result was a ruler who understood both diplomatic and military approaches to power but had a personal preference for the more aggressive methods that his stepmother had avoided. The new challenges facing Egypt were largely self-created, which is often the case when successful policies create conditions that eventually require different approaches. Hatshepsut's diplomatic success had created a peaceful international environment, but it had also allowed neighboring kingdoms to grow stronger and more independent while Egypt focused on internal development rather than imperial expansion. Several tributary states had started testing their boundaries during the succession transition, apparently assuming that Egyptian military capabilities had atrophied during the peaceful reign. This was like assuming that a sleeping lion had forgotten how to hunt just because it hadn't been eating anyone lately. Egyptian military technology, training, and organization had actually improved during Hatshepsut's reign, even though they hadn't been used aggressively. The army had spent 2 decades preparing for wars that didn't happen, which meant they were extraordinarily well prepared when Thutmose III finally decided to use military force to resolve international disputes. The evolution of the situation was rapid and decisive, demonstrating that political transitions can create momentum that carries far beyond what anyone originally intended. Within 2 years of assuming real authority, Thutmose III had launched his first major military campaign, beginning what would become 17 separate invasions that expanded Egypt's empire to its greatest territorial extent. It was like watching someone who had been forced to be polite at dinner parties for decades suddenly getting permission to express their true feelings about their neighbors through military conquest. Second generation effects included a complete transformation of Egypt's international reputation and relationships. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt had been seen as a wealthy, peaceful trading partner that preferred negotiation to warfare and resolved conflicts through economic incentives rather than military pressure. Under Thutmose III, Egypt became the ancient world's most feared military power, whose idea of diplomatic relations involved demanding tribute while pointing very large armies at anyone who seemed reluctant to pay. The transformation was so complete that foreign ambassadors who had grown accustomed to conducting business with Hatshepsut's diplomatic officials suddenly found themselves dealing with military commanders who viewed international relations as an extension of warfare by other means. The psychological adjustment required from Egypt's neighbors was probably significant. Imagine if Switzerland suddenly started behaving like the Roman Empire, and you'll get some sense of how disorienting this transformation must have been. The emergence of Thutmose III's sole rule brought an entirely new cast of characters to prominence in Egyptian government and society. These weren't just different people filling the same roles. They represented a completely different approach to power, leadership, and international relations that transformed Egypt from a peaceful superpower into an aggressive empire with imperial ambitions that extended far beyond anything Hatshepsut had ever contemplated. The most significant new figure was Amenheb, Thutmose III's chief military officer and the ancient equivalent of a special forces commander with a serious adrenaline addiction. Amenheb's tomb inscriptions read like the resume of someone who had confused military service with an extreme sports competition. He claimed to have personally killed elephants in hand-to-hand combat, captured enemy princes during cavalry charges, and survived enough battlefield wounds to qualify for a medical research study on human durability under combat conditions. Unlike Hatshepsut's civilian administrators, who had focused on trade agreements and construction projects, Thutmose III's officials were primarily military men whose idea of problem-solving involved increasingly creative applications of violence. It was like replacing a company's accounting department with a team of Navy SEALs and then being surprised when quarterly reports started including casualty statistics and recommendations for hostile takeovers of competing businesses. Amenheb's military innovations included new siege warfare techniques, improved cavalry tactics, and the development of logistic systems that allowed Egyptian armies to operate far from their bases for extended periods. His approach to warfare was both more sophisticated and more brutal than traditional Egyptian military methods, reflecting the influence of international conflicts and the adoption of military technologies from conquered territories. Another crucial new player was Rekhmire, who became vizier during Thutmose III's sole reign and had to manage the administrative challenges of running an empire that was constantly expanding through military conquest. Rekhmire's job was essentially to figure out how to govern territories that had been acquired through warfare while maintaining the domestic prosperity that had made Egyptian expansion possible in the first place. He had to develop new systems for administering conquered territories, managing tribute payments, and integrating foreign populations into Egyptian society. The roles these new figures played were fundamentally different from their predecessors in ways that reflected the complete transformation of Egyptian government priorities. While Hatshepsut's officials had been administrators, diplomats, and architects, Thutmose III's team were conquistadors, military engineers, and imperial governors. They weren't just serving a different pharaoh. They were implementing a completely different concept of what Egyptian power should look like and how it should be exercised. Their contributions included the development of new military technologies, innovative siege warfare techniques, and administrative systems for managing conquered territories that would influence imperial governance for centuries. But they also contributed to a transformation of Egyptian culture that emphasized military glory over artistic achievement and territorial expansion over peaceful prosperity. The stories of these new officials read like adventure novels written by someone with a serious military fetish and an unlimited budget for exotic locations and dangerous situations. One general supposedly captured an entire city by hiding soldiers inside tribute gifts, like an ancient Trojan horse strategy, except with more Egyptian pragmatism and fewer Greek dramatics. Another commander allegedly won battles by using captured enemy war elephants against their former owners, which sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but was apparently just Tuesday afternoon entertainment for Thutmose III's military machine. Januni was another important figure who served as a military scribe and administrator, responsible for keeping detailed records of military campaigns and managing the logistics of imperial expansion. His records provide some of the most detailed information about Egyptian military operations during this period, including lists of tribute payments, descriptions of conquered territories, and accounts of battles that reveal the systematic nature of Thutmose III's imperial expansion. But some problems persisted despite the dramatic change in leadership style and government priorities, demonstrating that certain challenges were inherent to governing a large, complex civilization regardless of the ruler's personal approach or policy preferences. The fundamental challenge of managing Egypt's enormous wealth and complex bureaucracy didn't disappear just because the pharaoh had traded diplomatic receptions for military campaigns. If anything, the addition of conquered territories and tribute obligations made administrative challenges more complex rather than simpler. The continuing challenges included maintaining domestic agricultural productivity, while significant portions of the male population were serving in foreign military campaigns. Egypt's prosperity still depended on the Nile's annual floods and the agricultural surplus they created. But Thutmose III's military adventures required manpower that had to come from somewhere. The solution involved developing more efficient agricultural techniques and reorganizing labor systems to accommodate the demands of both domestic production and imperial expansion. Religious administration became more complicated rather than less during the transition, creating new theological and political challenges that Hatshepsut's reign hadn't faced. While Hatshepsut's gender performance had created theological puzzles about divine kingship, Thutmose III's military campaigns raised different religious questions about the appropriate relationship between pharaonic authority and divine favor. The priests had to figure out how to interpret military victories as signs of divine approval while maintaining the peaceful religious traditions that had developed during Hatshepsut's reign. The new versions of old problems included diplomatic relations with kingdoms that had grown accustomed to Egypt's peaceful approach under Hatshepsut. Some former allies were confused by the sudden shift from trade negotiations to military threats, leading to diplomatic incidents that wouldn't have occurred under the previous administration. It was like having international partners who had gotten used to doing business with a reasonable negotiator suddenly find themselves dealing with someone whose opening position in every discussion was surrender or will conquer you. Managing the wealth that flowed into Egypt from conquered territories created new economic challenges that required different solutions from those Hatshepsut had developed for managing trade-based prosperity. Tribute payments came irregularly and in forms that weren't always immediately useful, requiring new systems for storage, distribution, and conversion into usable resources. Cyclical patterns emerged as Thutmose III's military campaigns created new administrative challenges that required solutions similar to those Hatshepsut had developed for managing peaceful prosperity. The skills needed to govern conquered territories weren't fundamentally different from those required to manage domestic construction projects. Both involved coordinating large workforces, managing complex logistics, and maintaining local cooperation through a combination of incentives and authority. The integration of foreign populations into Egyptian society created social and cultural challenges that persisted throughout Thutmose III's reign and beyond. Conquered peoples brought different languages, religions, and customs that had to be accommodated within Egyptian society while maintaining cultural unity and political loyalty. This required developing new approaches to cultural assimilation that balanced tolerance with control. Why certain issues proved intractable became clear over time. Some problems were inherent to ruling a large, complex civilization regardless of the ruler's personal style or policy preferences. Egypt's geographic advantages and disadvantages, its dependence on Nile agriculture, and its position as a crossroads between Africa and Asia, created persistent challenges that no amount of military conquest or diplomatic innovation could permanently solve. Compared to Hatshepsut's earlier period, Thutmose III's Egypt was more militarily powerful, but also more expensive to maintain, and more psychologically demanding for its rulers and administrators. The costs of supporting a professional army, capable of projecting power across the eastern Mediterranean, were significantly higher than the expenses of maintaining diplomatic relations and funding construction projects. It was like comparing the operational costs of running a peaceful trading company versus maintaining a military-industrial complex with global ambitions. The cultural and artistic achievements that had characterized Hatshepsut's reign gave way to military monuments and imperial architecture that celebrated conquest rather than peaceful prosperity. While both approaches produced impressive results, they reflected fundamentally different values and priorities that shaped Egyptian society in different ways. Compared to other contemporary civilizations, Egypt under Thutmose III became the ancient world's dominant military power, but at the cost of the cultural and artistic innovations that had characterized Hatshepsut's reign. Other kingdoms started copying Egyptian military techniques rather than Egyptian architectural styles, suggesting a shift in how Egyptian influence was perceived internationally. What was unique about this period was the speed and completeness of the transformation from peaceful to military leadership. Most civilizations evolved gradually from peaceful to military orientations, or vice versa. But Egypt's transition from Hatshepsut's diplomatic approach to Thutmose III's military expansion happened within a few years. It was like watching a country switch from Switzerland's foreign policy to Rome's imperial strategy within a single generation. What was universal about Egypt's experience was the difficulty of maintaining both domestic prosperity and foreign expansion simultaneously. Every ancient civilization that attempted to combine internal development with external conquest faced similar resource allocation challenges and administrative complexities that required constant balancing between competing priorities and demands. By the 22nd year of Hatshepsut's reign, signs pointed to the approaching end of ancient history's most successful experiment in cross-dressing leadership. The warning signs weren't dramatic. There were no palace coups, military rebellions, or economic crises that would make for exciting documentary footage. Instead, there was the much more mundane reality that Hatshepsut was aging. Thutmose III was growing impatient, and maintaining the elaborate gender performance that had enabled her reign was becoming increasingly difficult for everyone involved. The most obvious indication that change was coming was Hatshepsut's declining appearance at public ceremonies and state functions. For 2 decades, she had maintained a demanding schedule of religious festivals, diplomatic receptions, and construction site visits that required her to appear in full masculine pharaonic regalia while performing the physical demands of royal authority. But as she entered her 50s, the energy required for constant gender performance was taking its toll in ways that were becoming impossible to hide from court observers and foreign diplomats. The physical demands of pharaonic authority were considerable even under normal circumstances. Egyptian royal ceremonial required standing for hours in heavy regalia, participating in physically demanding religious rituals, and maintaining an imposing presence that demonstrated divine authority to audiences that included skeptical priests, ambitious nobles, and foreign ambassadors looking for signs of weakness. For Hatshepsut, these normal challenges were complicated by the additional effort required to maintain her masculine presentation while managing the practical difficulties of wearing fake beards, binding garments, and adopting masculine postures and gestures that weren't natural to her. What key players could see versus what they missed created interesting dynamics during this period that revealed the complexity of court politics and personal relationships. Thutmose III and his military supporters clearly recognized the transition was inevitable and began positioning themselves for the post-Hatshepsut era. They started building stronger relationships with younger officials, developing plans for more aggressive foreign policy, and generally preparing for a government that wouldn't require daily accommodation of a cross-dressing pharaoh. However, what many people missed was how attached the Egyptian people had become to the prosperity and stability of Hatshepsut's reign. While court officials were focused on succession politics and international, observers were analyzing Egypt's military capabilities. Ordinary Egyptians were enjoying the benefits of 22 years of peace, prosperity, and impressive construction. Projects that had employed thousands of workers and created lasting improvements to their communities. The idea that this golden age might end with Hatshepsut's decline wasn't something most people wanted to contemplate. Resistance to inevitable change came from predictable sources, but also from some unexpected ones that revealed the breadth of support Hatshepsut had built during her reign. Senenmen and other officials, whose careers were tied to Hatshepsut's success, obviously wanted to maintain the status quo as long as possible. But resistance also came from trade partners who had built profitable relationships with Egypt's peaceful, diplomatically oriented government and weren't eager to deal with a more militaristic successor who might prioritize conquest over commerce. The religious establishment was particularly conflicted about the approaching transition, caught between theological orthodoxy and practical success. On one hand, many priests were probably relieved at the prospect of returning to more orthodox arrangements where they wouldn't have to explain why their pharaoh wore a fake beard during sacred ceremonies. On the other hand, Hatshepsut's reign had been enormously profitable for the temples, funding construction projects and religious ceremonies on an unprecedented scale that had enriched religious institutions throughout Egypt. Foreign kingdoms were also divided in their responses to signs of change in Egyptian leadership. Some rulers who had found Hatshepsut's diplomatic approach frustrating looked forward to dealing with a more traditionally aggressive pharaoh. Others had benefited from Egypt's peaceful policies and were concerned about what changes in leadership might mean for their own security and prosperity. The actual end of Hatshepsut's active reign wasn't marked by a single dramatic event, but rather by a gradual withdrawal from public life that allowed Thutmose III to assume increasing authority without directly challenging his stepmother's remaining ceremonial status. It was like watching a CEO slowly transition to a chairman emeritus role, except the CEO had been cross-dressing for 22 years, and the successor was her stepson who'd been waiting for his inheritance since adolescence while building his own power base and developing very different ideas about how the company should be run. The specific events that marked the transition were subtle, but significant to anyone who understood Egyptian court protocol and royal symbolism. Hatshepsut's name began appearing less frequently in official inscriptions, while Thutmose III's royal cartouches became more prominent in temple reliefs and government documents. State ceremonies increasingly featured Thutmose III in the primary pharaonic role, with Hatshepsut appearing in a supporting capacity or sometimes not at all, creating a visual narrative of changing authority that was clear to anyone paying attention. The final major players in this transition included not just Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, but also the officials, who had to manage the practical aspects of transferring power from one ruler to another while maintaining government continuity. These bureaucrats faced the challenge of maintaining administrative effectiveness while accommodating a completely different leadership style and set of policy priorities. They had to figure out how to preserve the institutional knowledge and administrative systems that had made Hatshepsut's reign successful while adapting to new approaches that emphasized military solutions over diplomatic ones. One of the last attempts to preserve Hatshepsut's influence involved a series of inscriptions that emphasized her achievements and divine legitimacy, possibly created by officials who wanted to ensure her legacy would survive the transition. These texts read like a comprehensive defense of her reign, highlighting economic prosperity, architectural achievements, and divine favor as evidence that her unconventional rule had been successful and divinely approved. The inscriptions were essentially making the case that Hatshepsut's reign should be remembered as a golden age rather than an aberration. The final attempts to change things included Thutmose III's apparent efforts to accelerate the transition by taking on more visible royal responsibilities and making it clear that he was ready to assume sole authority. There's some evidence that he grew tired of the careful, gradual approach and began asserting his authority more directly in the final years of the joint reign, possibly because he was eager to begin implementing his own policies and approaches to royal leadership. Whether Hatshepsut's decline was gradual or involved more dramatic final moments is unclear from the historical record, which is frustrating for modern historians trying to understand the personal and political dynamics involved. What seems certain is that she retained some ceremonial authority until her death, but her real power had been transferred to Thutmose III before she actually died. The symbolic endpoint came when official documents began referring to Thutmose III's regnal years without reference to Hatshepsut's parallel reign. The most poignant aspect of the end was probably the dismantling of the elaborate social arrangements that had made Hatshepsut's gender performance possible. Officials who had spent decades learning to navigate the complex etiquette of addressing a cross-dressing pharaoh suddenly found themselves in a more conventional court environment where traditional masculine authority was the norm. The psychological adjustment must have been significant for people who had built their careers around accommodating unconventional leadership. The physical symbols of Hatshepsut's reign also began to change during this period. Some of her monuments were modified to emphasize Thutmose III's role. Her images were sometimes altered to appear more traditionally masculine and new construction. Projects began to reflect different priorities and aesthetic preferences that emphasized military themes over the peaceful prosperity that had characterized her building programs. The analysis of causes for Hatshepsut's reign's end reveals a complex interaction of biological inevitability, political pragmatism, and social exhaustion that created conditions where change became inevitable, regardless of individual preferences or political calculations. The most obvious factor was simple mortality. Hatshepsut was aging and couldn't maintain the demanding schedule of royal duties indefinitely. But the deeper causes involved the difficulty of sustaining an elaborate gender performance that required constant social cooperation and political accommodation from hundreds of officials, priests, and courtiers. Internal problems included the growing strain of maintaining a government structure that depended on everyone pretending they're female. Pharaoh was legitimately masculine for religious and political purposes. After 22 years, the cognitive dissonance required to participate in this fiction was probably wearing on everyone involved, creating psychological stress that affected decision-making and government efficiency. It was like working for a company where everyone had to maintain an obvious collective pretense. Eventually, the mental energy required becomes exhausting, and people start looking for alternatives. The administrative challenges of managing an increasingly complex empire while maintaining the elaborate protocols of Hatshepsut's gender performance, were also becoming unsustainable. As Egypt's territory and responsibilities expanded, the demands on royal authority increased in ways that made the time and energy required for gender performance increasingly problematic. Efficient government required streamlined decision-making processes that were incompatible with the elaborate social choreography necessary to maintain Hatshepsut's masculine presentation. External pressures came from neighboring kingdoms that had grown stronger during Egypt's peaceful period and were beginning to test Egyptian resolve in ways that required more aggressive responses. Thutmose III and his military supporters argued that the kingdom needed more traditional masculine leadership to maintain its international position, and they weren't wrong about the changing strategic environment. Several tributary states had started withholding payments and testing Egyptian responses to see if the peaceful pharaoh would actually enforce her authority through military action. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending Hatshepsut's reign is debatable and reveals the complexity of political change in ancient societies. On one hand, specific people like Thutmose III clearly played crucial roles in accelerating the transition by demonstrating their readiness for leadership and building support for change. On the other hand, the broader forces of political tradition, religious orthodoxy, and international pressure were probably too strong for any individual to resist indefinitely. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question that illuminates the constraints and possibilities of ancient political innovation. Hatshepsut might have managed a longer reign if she had designated a female successor and established precedents for female rule, but Egyptian society probably wasn't ready for such a dramatic break with tradition. Alternatively, she could have formally adopted Thutmose III as her son rather than stepson, which might have strengthened their joint authority, but this would have required even more elaborate legal fiction and might not have addressed the fundamental gender issues. The question of inevitability versus contingency is complex and depends on how you assess the relative importance of individual agency and structural constraints. Hatshepsut's eventual decline was probably inevitable given her age and the social pressures surrounding her unconventional reign. However, the specific timing and manner of the transition were influenced by contingent factors like her health, Thutmose III's ambitions, and the international situation that could have developed differently under other circumstances. The immediate aftermath of Hatshepsut's transition to ceremonial status was surprisingly smooth, suggesting that the gradual nature of the change had allowed Egyptian institutions to adapt without major disruption. Thutmose III's assumption of full pharaonic authority didn't result in civil war, economic crisis, or international instability, a testament to the careful management of the succession process and the institutional strength that Hatshepsut's government had built over 2 decades. Who stepped into the vacuum was clear. Thutmose III became sole pharaoh with full authority over military, religious, and civilian administration. But the transition also involved the emergence of new officials whose careers were built around traditional masculine leadership rather than accommodation of unconventional gender performance. These new administrators brought different skills and priorities that reflected the changing nature of Egyptian government under Thutmose III's leadership. The short-term consequences included a rapid shift in government priorities from construction and diplomacy to military expansion and imperial conquest. Thutmose III launched his first major military campaign within months of assuming sole authority, beginning the series of 17 invasions that would define his reign and expand Egypt's empire to its greatest extent. The speed of this shift demonstrated how much military planning had been happening behind the scenes during the final years of Hatshepsut's reign. Contemporary reactions to the transition were probably mixed and reflected different perspectives on what constituted successful leadership. Military commanders and younger officials who had chafed under Hatshepsut's peaceful policies likely welcomed the change and looked forward to opportunities for military advancement and imperial expansion. Older bureaucrats and officials whose careers had been built around her administration may have been more ambivalent about the new direction, recognizing its necessity while regretting the end of an era that had brought unprecedented prosperity and stability. The attempts at revival or continuation were subtle but significant in their implications for how political transitions are managed. Some of Hatshepsut's officials tried to maintain influence under the new regime by emphasizing the administrative and economic achievements of her reign and positioning themselves as indispensable advisors who could help Thutmose III maintain the prosperity that had characterized the previous administration. Senemet, for example, apparently tried to position himself as an essential bridge between the old and new administrations, though this strategy ultimately failed, as Thutmose III preferred to work with officials who shared his military orientation. The legacy of Hatshepsut's 22-year reign shaped Egyptian politics and international relations for centuries after her death, though not always in ways she would have appreciated or anticipated. Her most immediate influence was on Thutmose III himself, who spent the rest of his reign trying to prove that traditional masculine leadership could be just as effective as his stepmother's unconventional approach, a psychological dynamic that led to some of the most aggressive military expansion in ancient history and created an imperial legacy that would define Egypt for generations. The psychological complexity of Thutmose III's response to Hatshepsut's reign cannot be understated. He had spent his entire adult life watching his stepmother successfully run the empire he was supposed to inherit, learning statecraft while being relegated to secondary roles, and observing the effectiveness of approaches to leadership that were completely different from traditional pharaonic models. The result was a ruler who understood both diplomatic and military approaches to power, but felt compelled to demonstrate that his masculine authority could achieve even greater success than her unconventional methods. Later generations of Egyptians viewed Hatshepsut's reign with a mixture of pride and embarrassment that probably sounds familiar to anyone who's ever had a relative who was simultaneously successful and deeply eccentric. Egyptian historians acknowledged her achievements while carefully emphasizing that her cross-dressing, pharaonic performance had been a unique historical aberration rather than a model for future female leadership. They wanted to claim credit for her success while maintaining that such unconventional approaches weren't necessary or desirable under normal circumstances. The specific influences of her reign appeared in unexpected places throughout later Egyptian history, demonstrating how political innovations can have lasting effects even when they're not directly continued. Her architectural innovations, particularly the terrace design of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, influenced rural building projects for generations and established aesthetic principles that would appear in Egyptian architecture for centuries. Her diplomatic strategies and trade relationships provided models that later pharaohs adapted for their own international relations, even when they preferred military solutions to economic ones. The administrative system she developed for managing large-scale construction projects and coordinating complex government operations became standard practices that outlasted her reign and influenced how later rulers approached the challenges of governing a large, complex civilization. Her innovations in bureaucratic organization and record-keeping created efficiencies that made it easier for subsequent pharaohs to manage imperial expansion and territorial administration. The myths versus realities that developed around Hatshepsut's reign reveal how uncomfortable later generations were with the idea of successful female leadership and how Historical narratives get shaped by contemporary prejudices. Over time, her story was gradually rewritten to emphasize either her feminine weakness, she was supposedly manipulated by male advisors, or her masculine characteristics, she was basically a man in a woman's body. Both narratives avoided the obvious conclusion that women could rule effectively while remaining female, and that gender presentation might be less important than competence and political skill. One of the most persistent myths was that Hatshepsut had somehow usurped power from Thutmose III through feminine manipulation and political scheming, completely ignoring the legal basis for her regency and the demonstrable success of her policies. This narrative ignored the fact that she had served as regent for legitimate reasons and had governed successfully for over 2 decades while building Egypt's prosperity and international prestige. It was easier for later male rulers to believe that she had stolen power than to acknowledge that she had earned it through competence and effective leadership. The reality was that Hatshepsut had demonstrated remarkable political skill, administrative ability, and strategic vision while simultaneously managing one of the most challenging gender performance requirements in political history. Her reign had been marked by prosperity, stability, and impressive achievements that later pharaohs struggled to match, regardless of their gender presentation or conformity to traditional expectations about royal authority. Why her reign remained important to some and forgotten by others reflected broader tensions about women's roles in political authority and the discomfort that successful female leadership could create for societies built around assumptions of male dominance. Rulers who wanted to justify their own unconventional approaches to power could point to Hatshepsut's success as precedent. Rulers who preferred traditional arrangements could dismiss her reign as an anomaly that proved the wisdom of masculine leadership and conventional gender roles. Today, we can see echoes of Hatshepsut's challenges in contemporary discussions about women's leadership styles, workplace gender performance, and the double standards that female executives face in corporate and political environments. Like Hatshepsut, modern women in positions of authority often find themselves navigating impossible expectations about how to present themselves professionally while maintaining their effectiveness as leaders. The fundamental dynamic of having to prove competence while managing gender expectations remains remarkably consistent across 3.5 millennia. The specific parallels are striking and sometimes darkly humorous in their persistence. Modern female executives often describe feeling pressure to adopt more masculine communication styles, dress codes, and management approaches to be taken seriously by male colleagues and subordinates. While contemporary women don't have to wear fake beards to board meetings, the underlying dynamic of having to perform gender differently in professional contexts remains remarkably similar to what Hatshepsut experienced. The costume requirements have changed, but the performance demands haven't. Hatshepsut's experience with being simultaneously praised for her achievements and criticized for her unconventional presentation mirrors contemporary discussions about female politicians who are judged as much for their appearance and personal style as for their policy positions. The ancient Egyptian requirement that she appear masculine to be taken seriously as a ruler is not fundamentally different from modern expectations that female leaders demonstrate gravitas through traditionally masculine traits like assertiveness, emotional control, and aggressive decision-making. The bureaucratic challenges that Hatshepsut's officials faced in navigating pronoun usage and ceremonial protocol have obvious parallels in contemporary workplace discussions about inclusive language and gender-neutral communication. While the specific context is different, the underlying challenge of creating institutional practices that accommodate non-traditional gender presentations remains remarkably consistent. Modern organizations struggling with diversity and inclusion initiatives might learn from studying how ancient Egyptian bureaucrats managed to adapt their procedures to accommodate unconventional leadership. what hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency to judge female leaders by different standards than male leaders, to assume that women in power must have achieved their positions through manipulation rather than merit, and to treat unconventional leadership styles as personal character flaws rather than strategic choices. Hatshepsut faced criticism for being too peaceful, too focused on construction rather than conquest, and too willing to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than violence. Criticisms that sound remarkably similar to modern complaints about soft female leadership. The psychological costs of constantly performing gender in professional contexts also remain consistent across historical periods. Modern research on women in leadership positions has documented the exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring and adjusting gender presentation to meet professional expectations. Hatshepsut's experience suggests that these costs have been a persistent feature of female leadership for thousands of years, indicating that the problem is structural rather than individual. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in contemporary politics, where female leaders are often caught between expectations that they demonstrate both feminine empathy and masculine strength, both collaborative decision-making and decisive authority. The impossible balancing act that Hatshepsut performed for 22 years, being feminine enough to be acceptable and masculine enough to be effective, remains a challenge for women in leadership positions today, though the specific requirements have evolved with changing social norms. The lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of institutional support for unconventional leadership styles, the costs of requiring people to perform gender differently in professional contexts, and the potential benefits of evaluating leaders based on results rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Hatshepsut's success suggests that diverse leadership approaches can be highly effective when given appropriate support and accommodation, but it also demonstrates the personal costs involved in challenging established norms. Corporate environments might learn from Hatshepsut's experience about the importance of creating systems that accommodate different leadership styles rather than requiring everyone to conform to traditional masculine models. Her reign demonstrates that effective leadership can take many forms and that organizations benefit when they're flexible enough to support unconventional approaches that produce good results. Even now, Hatshepsut's reign influences multiple areas of modern scholarship, popular culture, and political discourse in ways that would probably surprise her. Academic studies of her reign have become central to discussions about women's leadership in ancient civilizations, challenging assumptions about gender roles in early complex societies and providing evidence that female political authority was more common and successful than previously recognized. Her story has forced historians to reconsider their assumptions about ancient gender dynamics and to recognize that women's exclusion from political power was less universal than once believed. Archaeological research continues to reveal new information about her reign, with recent discoveries providing insights into the administrative systems she developed and the economic policies that made her rule so successful. Modern excavations at her mortuary temple and other sites associated with her reign have uncovered evidence of the sophisticated bureaucratic machinery that enabled her to govern effectively while managing the complex requirements of gender performance. Her story has become a touchstone in popular culture representations of powerful women, though often in ways that emphasize her gender performance rather than her political achievements. Modern retellings tend to focus on the dramatic aspects of her cross-dressing rather than the administrative competence that made her reign successful, which probably misses the point of why her story matters. The focus on costume and performance often overshadows the more important lessons about leadership, political innovation, and institutional development. Political discourse about women's leadership frequently references Hatshepsut as an example of ancient female political authority. though these references often oversimplify the complex social arrangements that enabled her reign. She's become a symbol of female empowerment without sufficient attention to the specific historical context that made her success possible, or the costs involved in achieving and maintaining her authority. Modern discussions sometimes use her as proof that women have always been capable of leadership while ignoring the extraordinary circumstances required to make such leadership acceptable. Social movements advocating for gender equality in leadership positions have adopted Hatshepsut as a historical precedent, arguing that her success demonstrates the long history of effective female governance. While this usage is generally positive, it sometimes ignores the costs and compromises that her reign required from everyone involved. The reality of her experience was more complex than simple inspiration. It involved daily, psychological demands and social accommodations that most modern advocates probably wouldn't want to accept as necessary conditions for female leadership. The continuing academic interest in her reign has led to significant archaeological discoveries and historical research that have expanded understanding of ancient Egyptian politics, gender roles, and royal administration. Modern excavations at her mortuary temple and other sites associated with her reign continue to provide new insights into how her government actually functioned and how she managed to maintain authority while challenging fundamental assumptions about royal gender identity. Why people still care about Hatshepsut's story reflects ongoing contemporary concerns about gender equality, leadership effectiveness, and the challenges of balancing traditional expectations with innovative approaches to authority. Her reign provides historical perspective on questions that remain unresolved in modern political and corporate contexts, offering both inspiration and cautionary lessons about the costs and benefits of challenging established social norms. The most significant aspect of her continuing influence may be how her story demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of individual achievement within constraining social systems. Hatshepsut succeeded remarkably within the boundaries of what ancient Egyptian society would accept, but her success required constant accommodation to expectations that limited her authentic self-expression. This dynamic remains relevant for understanding how social change happens and what costs are involved in challenging traditional power structures. Educational institutions have increasingly incorporated her story into curricula about ancient history and women's studies, using her reign as a case study in leadership, political innovation, and gender dynamics. Her experience provides concrete historical examples for discussions about the relationship between individual agency and social constraints, the cost of nonconformity, and the potential benefits of institutional flexibility. Her architectural legacy provides the most tangible continuing influence. Her mortuary temple remains one of ancient Egypt's most impressive buildings, and her obelisks still stand in locations around the world. These physical monuments ensure that her story continues to be told, even when the political and social context of her reign becomes increasingly distant from contemporary experience. The irony is that Hatshepsut's most lasting influence may be architectural rather than political, achieved through the monuments she built rather than the precedents she established for female leadership. Looking back across 22 years of the most unconventional leadership experiment in ancient history, we've seen how one woman transformed herself into a pharaoh through sheer force of will, political skill, and an impressive collection of fake facial hair that would make a theatrical costume department weep with envy. The key patterns that emerge from Hatshepsut's reign include the importance of institutional flexibility, the costs of social innovation, and the surprising effectiveness of leadership styles that challenge traditional expectations while delivering concrete results that benefit everyone involved. The major themes that defined her story were the tension between individual ambition and social constraints, the relationship between gender performance and political authority, and the question of whether results matter more than conformity to established norms. Hatshepsut spent 2 decades proving that women could rule as effectively as men, but she had to dress up as a man to make the point, which says something profound about both her personal determination and her society's limitations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved, least of all Hatshepsut herself, who probably would have preferred to govern without having to maintain an elaborate daily costume routine. Our most surprising discoveries about her reign involve how normal the abnormal situation became for everyone involved. After a few years, Egyptian officials, foreign diplomats, and ordinary citizens apparently adjusted to having a cross-dressing pharaoh with the same adaptability that modern people show when their company gets a new CEO with unconventional management styles. Humans are remarkably good at accepting strange situations when the alternative is chaos and the results are prosperity, stability, and impressive construction projects that employ thousands of workers. The psychological resilience required from everyone in Hatshepsut's government was extraordinary. Court officials had to maintain complex social performances that accommodated her gender presentation while conducting serious business about international relations, economic policy, and military strategy. Foreign diplomats had to figure out how to conduct negotiations with a pharaoh who was obviously female but insisted on masculine titles and ceremonial protocols. Even ordinary Egyptians had to participate in collective fiction about their rulers. Gender identity while going about their daily lives and managing their own concerns about agricultural cycles, family responsibilities, and local community affairs. The most important takeaways from Hatshepsut's story include the recognition that effective leadership can take many forms, that social change often requires individuals willing to bear personal costs for broader benefits, and that institutional success sometimes depends on everyone agreeing to maintain useful fictions that enable functional cooperation. Her reign demonstrated that ancient societies were more flexible about gender roles than we often assume, but also that such flexibility came with significant psychological and social overhead that affected everyone involved. How our understanding of her reign has evolved reflects broader changes in how historians approach questions about women's roles in ancient societies, the relationship between individual agency and social structures, and the importance of looking beyond official narratives to understand how historical societies actually functioned. Early historians dismissed Hatshepsut as an anomaly or usurper. Modern scholarship recognizes her as a skilled ruler whose success challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient political possibilities and demonstrated that effective governance could transcend traditional gender expectations when circumstances required innovative solutions. The journey through her story has taken us from the practical challenges of gender performance in royal context to the broader questions about leadership, legitimacy, and social innovation that remain relevant in contemporary political and corporate environments. Her reign serves as a case study in how individuals can succeed within constraining social systems, while simultaneously demonstrating the costs and limitations of such success. The lessons are applicable to modern discussions about diversity in leadership, the challenges of organizational change, and the relationship between individual achievement and institutional flexibility. Perhaps most significantly, Hatshepsut's story illustrates the complex relationship between personal authenticity and professional effectiveness. She achieved remarkable success as a ruler, but only by constantly performing a gender identity that wasn't authentically her own. This dynamic raises questions about the costs of success and the nature of authentic leadership that contemporary executives and politicians continue to navigate in their own careers and professional relationships. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes of Hatshepsut's reign involves the discovery of her mummy in 2007, over 3,000 years after her death. Archaeologists identified her remains using dental evidence and DNA analysis. But what makes the story particularly appropriate is that her mummy was found not in a grand royal tomb, but in a simple burial that had been overlooked for decades by researchers who assumed that someone so important must be somewhere more obvious and dramatic. The symbolism is perfect. Even in death, Hatshepsut was hiding in plain sight, her true identity obscured by the assumption that someone so important must be somewhere more obvious. It took modern forensic science to definitively prove what the ancient Egyptians had known but later generations had forgotten, that this unremarkable-looking mummy was actually one of history's most successful rulers. The discovery required sophisticated scientific analysis to confirm what should have been obvious from historical records, demonstrating how easily important stories can be lost when they don't fit comfortable narratives about power and authority. What this story reveals about the broader themes is that Hatshepsut's greatest achievement may have been her ability to maintain effectiveness while navigating impossible social constraints. She ruled successfully for over 2 decades while constantly managing the contradiction between her authentic identity and her professional requirements, between her personal relationships and her public persona, between her individual ambitions and her society's expectations. The psychological demands would have broken most people, but she somehow managed to maintain both personal integrity and political effectiveness while constantly performing a role that wasn't naturally hers. The discovery of her mummy also speaks to how historical memory works and why some stories get lost while others survive. Hatshepsut's architectural monuments ensured that her name would be remembered, but the details of her personal story, including the location of her actual remains, were forgotten because they didn't fit comfortable narratives about royal authority and gender roles. Later generations preferred to remember her achievements while forgetting the unconventional methods she used to accomplish them. How this connects to everything we've discussed is that Hatshepsut's reign was fundamentally about the possibility and costs of being exceptional within a system that doesn't normally accommodate such exceptions. She succeeded remarkably, but her success required constant vigilance, political skill, and personal sacrifice that would have exhausted most people. The fact that she maintained this performance for 22 years, while governing effectively, speaks to extraordinary personal resilience and political intelligence that shouldn't be underestimated or romanticized. The memorable final image that her story leaves us with is not the dramatic scenes of royal ceremony or military consultation, but the quieter picture of a middle-aged woman putting on her ceremonial beard each morning and preparing to spend another day convincing the ancient world that she was qualified to make decisions about their collective future. The mundane reality of her daily gender performance is somehow more impressive than the spectacular achievements it enabled, because it represents the kind of persistent individual effort that makes social change possible. The story suggests is that the most profound social changes often happen through individual persistence rather than dramatic confrontations, through people willing to bear personal costs for broader benefits, and through the accumulation of daily choices to maintain useful fictions that enable everyone to function within changing circumstances. Hatshepsut's legacy isn't just about female leadership. It's about the relationship between individual determination and social possibility, the costs of innovation, and the ways that exceptional people can expand the boundaries of what their societies consider normal or acceptable. As we reach the end of this journey through ancient Egypt's most unconventional royal reign, it's worth reflecting on what Hatshepsut's story tells us about the relationship between individual determination and social possibility. She didn't fundamentally change Egyptian society's attitudes about gender and leadership. That would take many more centuries and very different historical circumstances. But she did prove that such changes were possible, even if they required extraordinary personal sacrifice and social cooperation that shouldn't be necessary, but often is. The gentle conclusion to her story is that she succeeded remarkably within the constraints of her time and place, demonstrating possibilities that her society was barely prepared to acknowledge. Her reign stands as evidence that human societies are more flexible than they often appear, but also that such flexibility comes with costs that shouldn't be underestimated or romanticized. The psychological demands of constantly performing gender. In professional contexts, the social energy required to maintain collective fictions, and the personal sacrifices involved in challenging established norms, all took their toll on everyone involved. Our appreciation for this journey through her reign should include recognition of both her individual achievements and the collaborative effort required from everyone who enabled her success. The officials who learned to navigate complex pronoun usage, the priests who developed theological justifications for unconventional royal authority, and the ordinary Egyptians who accepted prosperity regardless of their pharaoh's personal style, all contributed to making her reign possible. Her success was a collective achievement that required cooperation from hundreds of people who had to constantly manage their own cognitive dissonance about gender, authority, and social norms. The invitation to reflection that her story offers is about the ongoing relevance of questions she faced. How do we balance individual authenticity with professional effectiveness? What costs are acceptable for challenging social norms? How do we evaluate leaders by their conformity to traditional expectations or by their actual results? These questions remain as relevant today as they were 35 centuries ago, and Hatshepsut's experience provides both inspiration and cautionary lessons for anyone grappling with similar challenges. The peaceful closing thought that emerges from Hatshepsut's story is that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptability and cooperation when circumstances require it. Her reign succeeded because people chose to prioritize collective prosperity over individual comfort with traditional arrangements. In an era when social change often seems impossible and political divisions insurmountable, there's something encouraging about remembering that humans have successfully navigated much stranger and more challenging circumstances than most of us face today. The ultimate lesson may be that progress often requires individuals willing to bear personal costs for broader benefits, societies willing to experiment with uncomfortable new arrangements, and institutions flexible enough to accommodate human complexity. Hatshepsut's reign achieved all three, which is why her story continues to resonate across millennia, and why those granite obelisks she erected are still standing, quietly proclaiming that she was here, she mattered, and she governed well regardless of what anyone thought about her fake beard. Her legacy reminds us that the boundaries of what's possible are often more flexible than they appear, that individual determination can create opportunities for social change, and that sometimes the most important thing exceptional people can do is prove that the exceptions are possible. Whether we're talking about ancient Egyptian royal succession or modern corporate leadership, the fundamental challenges of balancing authenticity with effectiveness, managing social expectations while pursuing individual goals, and creating institutional flexibility that accommodates human diversity remain remarkably consistent. Hatshepsut's story suggests that these challenges can be met successfully, but it also honestly acknowledges the costs involved and the cooperation required from everyone involved in making change possible.